Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. The poem of the day today is by a poet whose work I know pretty well. That's HD. This poem, Evening, appears, if we click the Read More, this will bring us to the poem's main page on Poetry Foundation, and it indicates that the source is the collected poems 1912 to 1944. Sometimes online, when you find a poem and the source is an edition of collected poetry like this, it can be a little frustrating because unless you have access to that book, it's hard. You don't really know when in that era. I mean, that's quite a gap, 32 years there. Where does this poem fall in HD's career? So luckily, I own a copy of that book, and Evening appears very early on page 18, I think. Yes, it runs from 18 to 19. So it's an early poem for HD and sort of falls in a phase of her career that's often aligned or associated with imagism. I'm not going to get into that. I might when I start to take some notes, but for the most part, we'll sort of keep it light here in terms of the lecturing. Evening by HD. Let's read it. The light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. The hepaticas widespread, under the light grow faint. The petals reach inward. The blue tips bend toward the bluer heart, and the flowers are lost. The cornel buds are still white, but shadows dart from the cornel roots. Black creeps from root to root. Each leaf cuts another leaf on the grass. Shadow seeks shadow, then both leaf and leaf shadow are lost. All right. Evening by HD. This won't take quite as long to work on as Keats did the other day. Let's zoom out just a bit. Always a pleasure to read HD's work. Let's count the lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that first stanza is 10 lines. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 lines. Two stanzas of a 10 and a 9-line stanza. I think I have that right. Let's highlight every fifth line. Yep, so that looks like 19 lines. Okay, in terms of line length, what are we dealing with here? The light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. I mean, the hepaticas widespread. Okay, so that line's a little longer. Under the light, petals reach inward. The cornel buds are still white. So you're dealing with black creeps from root to root. Roughly, short lines, 4 to 7 syllables in length. The number of stressed beats, probably less variable. The cornel buds are still white, but shadows dart from the cornel roots. Black creeps from root to root. Each leaf. Oh man, we have 2 syllables in that one. cuts another leaf on the grass. So number of stressed beats varies. It's usually at least two, it seems like. Sometimes there's three. The leaf shadow are lost. Then both leaf and leaf shadow are lost. Though here maybe there's just one stressed beat. Anyway, I wouldn't say this is metered poetry, though. It seems, although maybe it is. The light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. The hepaticas, widespread under the light, grow faint. Maybe. There's grow faint again with a two syllable line. Okay, 19 lines, 2 stanzas. Let's check on enjambment. I'm just getting my bean counting section sorted. All right, enjambment passes from, so that's one to two. Passes from, and then widespread under 4 to 5. Light grow 5 to 6. Then near the end of the stanza, you have 2 in a row. Bend toward, that's an 8 to 9. And heart and 9 to 10. So yeah, half the lines in stanza 1 are enjambed. What stanza 2 look like? Dart from lines 12 to 13. Leaf cuts, it's 15 to 16. Then leaf and 18 to 19. Okay, so out of 19 lines, 3, 6, 8. So less than half of them are enjambed in this poem. You have half of them enjambed in stanza 1, but then stanza 2, the frequency of enjambments goes down to lower frequency. Only 3 instances in this stanza. The stanza is a little shorter, but just by 1 line. But the number of enjambments goes down by 2. Okay. So what that tells me is, yeah, I mean, I don't know what it tells me, to be honest. But I guess it's just worth kind of being aware that, I mean, what that tells me is if fewer than half of the lines are enjambed, that the poem is probably carefully controlling and signaling to the reader its pauses. In other words, it's guiding us quite explicitly and not necessarily asking us to work out for it where its sentence or where its sentences separate, what sort of organizational schemas are at play in the sentences. Okay. All right. So you don't get the kind of effects that we get in some of the other poets we've looked at who mostly do away with punctuation altogether, or who limit their use of punctuation to just certain marks. So in a way, we could say in a sense that HD, even though this poem is very different from Ode to a Nightingale, which we looked at yesterday, it's still drawing on almost the full repertoire of punctuation marks available to a writer, to a verbal artist, language artist. Okay, punctuation, speaking of which, what are they? So we have commas in lines 2, 4, 7. It's nice that this is a 19-line poem because I can see these pretty quickly. 11, 14, 16, and 17. I might have missed a couple. So we have commas in quite a few lines. In 7 of the lines, we have commas. Dashes in line 3, 6. Do we have another? Yep. 13 and 13. Okay. Periods, lines 10 and 19. So even though this poem might be associated with, avant-garde writing, the early 20th century, it still follows certain kind of conventions of verse poetry, lyric poetry, where sometimes the stanza is sort of synced up with a syntactic unit. We saw that a little bit again in Keats yesterday. Very different poems, but there's a sort of coordination of syntax according to stanza, not necessarily according to line. Hyphen. Do you have any hyphens in the first stanza? Doesn't look like it, but we have one in line 11, Cornell buds. Line 13. I don't know what Cornell buds are, so I would have to look them up. That would be part of the the contexts section, perhaps. And then leaf shadow at the very end. So we have 3 hyphenated words in the second stanza. Is that it though? No semicolons. Doesn't look like it. And so maybe it would be too much of an exaggeration to say that the poet, that HD, draws on the full repertoire of punctuation. There's no colons, there's no semicolons. There's just three kinds of major punctuation marks: commas, dashes, periods, with commas being the most frequent. Oh no, we do have a hyphen in the first stanza. My goodness, always missing stuff. Line 4 with widespread. I think that's it though. So no semicolons, but it does seem like the poem uses dashes in place of semicolons. So dashes don't set off dependent clauses. They mark the sort of articulation of independent clauses the way a semicolon would. And so the poet is perhaps using the dash because it's more visually, it's a very much stronger visual cue than a semicolon, which can sometimes be hard to see because it takes up not that much more space than a period or a comma. Okay, same thing here. No apostrophes. We usually see an apostrophe because usually, I mean, possessive nouns are so common in English poetry that you tend to see at least an apostrophe because of that. And then in more contemporary poems, certainly the use of contractions, or sometimes poets use contractions to sort of fit the line to a certain meter, but we don't see that here. Okay, I think that's it in terms of punctuation. Pronouns. You ready for this? Hold on. Before I say this, can we double check? Let's read the poem one more time. It won't take long. And let's look for them together. The light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. The hepaticas, widespread under the light, grow faint. The petals reach inward. The blue tips bend toward the bluer heart, and the flowers are lost. The cornel buds are still white, but shadows dart from the cornel roots. Black creeps from root to root. Each leaf cuts another leaf on the grass. Shadow seeks shadow, then both leaf and shadow are lost. No pronouns. I think I mentioned this something about something. I think I meant when I was looking at a poem by Wallace Stevens. I think that poem had pronouns, but there weren't very many of them. So this might be the first poem we've looked at where there are no pronouns. What are the implications of that? No lyric I, right? So no self reference here. No pronouns for people or personifying gendered pronouns for things. So nothing like that. All the nouns are concrete nouns, right? Naming actual objects or phenomena. So we have instead the light, ridge, flower, specific species of flower also referenced. Um, and the poem also leans into repetition. So you have the cornel buds, but you don't need to say but shadows dart from their roots, but instead the word cornel is repeated again to indicate the roots. Okay. All right. Interesting. Implication. So there's no lyric I. I guess that's not an implication. That's just an identification that there is none. So let's try to expand on that a little bit if we can. No lyric I, no pronouns for people or personifying gendered pronouns for things. This already suggests that the poem is not about, at least directly, a dramatic situation, right? Not necessarily meditation heavy with content. So if it's meditative, it's meditative more in the kind of way that the haikus by Jack Kerouac are kind of meditative, right? Um, and maybe even more abstracted than that, where the lyric I is almost completely emptied of itself. Not necessarily a meditation heavy with content. Instead, the focus is on concrete nouns, which are always named, always named. Okay, seems important. Let's do sound and sense. The light passes from ridge to ridge. So repetition is really important. So you have the repetition of ridge, flower, light, blue, bluer. So all these words, Cornell is repeated, root, shadow, and leaf. These are all words. There might be others here, but these are all words, and they're all, notice, uh, all of them, I think, except blue and blue are all nouns, right? All nouns. So, that's at least the sound of the poem. It's a poem that leans into and takes a kind of pleasure in naming and renaming things, phenomena in the world, and the sound of those words seems to matter. Uh, and a lot of the alliteration of the poem seems to come from just that repetition of the same word. You do have the B sounds of blue tips bend toward the bluer, right? We have that there. the B and T sounds. B and T sounds, you get the tips toward heart, right? So the T rounds that out. Uh, so you have a bit of that there. But otherwise, the sounds seem to be controlled through the repetition. So you have the R sounds here, Cornell, but that R sounds comes from the repetition of Cornell and then the double repetition of root. Okay. Leaf, leaf, shadow, lost, right? You have the L sounds at the end there. Leaf and leaf, shadow. And that shadow repeats. The shadow from two lines above are lost. So you have, I mean, it does have a lot of sonic repetition in it, but it's not the kind of ornate phrasing we see, for instance, in Gerard Manley Hopkins. We see, or I can't remember because we didn't listen for sound and sense with Keats's poem, but I'm sure there would have been plenty of patterns there to also track. Though certainly sounds very different than Hopkins does. Repetition, BT sounds, L sounds. Okay, so what about sense? What's going on? So this is where sometimes we get tripped up. We might get tripped up when approaching a poem like HD's in the way we might get tripped up looking at Wallace Stevens because there's not the you know I usually shy away from asking students what they think the story of a poem is because my sense is poems aren't stories in the same way in the way that narratives are stories. Hello, Lila. So but but there is often a situation at least that you could spin a story out of. This one's pretty hard to describe as a situation that isn't just a moment of observing something. And this is and so in that sense we have a situation that's very abstract and also in kind of the sense we saw with Wallace Stevens's Of Mere Being a week or two. How many videos ago was that? Um, okay, the light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. The hepaticas widespread under the light grow faint. So a speaker tries concisely and precisely to describe the dynamic interaction of light and plant flower. That's kind of it, right? The light passing and the different effects of that. The light passing, but then the actual flowers, hepaticas, sort of widespread under the light. What does it mean that they grow faint? Hmm. They grow difficult to see, right? Is, a description of darkness falling. As he says this, he remembers remember the title. Oh boy. Sometimes. Remember the title, everybody, right? Evenings. This is what we're getting. Remember, this is the stage. I think this is the step when trying to establish the prose sense, where maybe it's a good idea to go back and think about the significance of a title. And in many of HD's early poems, maybe in all of her poems, the title does a lot of work because the poems themselves are so concentrated, saturated with imagery, or sort of dropped in the middle of a moment of maybe dropped in the middle of a moment of just kind of perception that doesn't necessarily include a lot of lyric commentary or self-reference or direct address. And so the title really does do a lot of work of signaling to you how you might start to reckon with what it's doing or how you might, might get just a bit more pleasure out of it as you think about what it's doing. All right, so description of so growing faint, light is passing, darkness is falling, though the darkness is not referenced in stanza one. Okay. The speaker in the final four lines, begins to describe visual effect. Let's just call it visual effects, right? What visual effects? Um, and we have sort of looking ahead to the next step, which I probably won't get into today. Maybe we'll come back to HD tomorrow and finish out the rest of this. Um, we have some personification potentially happening here, or at least some animating description, right, of petals reaching, tips bending, and something being lost. So the flowers themselves are no longer, you can't see them anymore. Note that the poet doesn't say, I can't see them anymore. It's just the flowers are lost. To whom or to what? But the poem doesn't say, because the poem is kind of shielding us, or shielding the speaker, at least from reference. The speaker is still the one conveying these words to us. So referenced is then other flowers. Again, I'm not familiar with Cornell buds, so I'm not sure if because of the color of them, that they're still visible in the darkness. Oh, but no, it's just another. The second stanza repeats the process of the first with another plant or flower. Those of you who may be familiar with what this is are maybe shaking your fist at the screen. Gosh darn it, Ben, look this up, and maybe again I will sort of pick this back up in a future video. So it repeats this process, but you see the repetition is the same but different. Ends with a different image, right? Not just the flowers, not just the things are lost, but their trace, their shadow, right? Um, when darkness completely falls, it's not just you can't. It's not just that you can't see you anymore or things anymore. You also can't see the shadows they cast, because for shadows to be cast, you need light. And I mean, this makes perfect sense, but the poem is sort of because of how it's organized, suggesting some kind of significance, um, giving us something to think about here. Something is lost, but then also the traces of that thing, the effects that thing has on its surroundings, that too is lost. Okay. Evening by HD. Great. I think we'll definitely come back to this poem tomorrow. It's nice to have a little homework, a little homework to do for the week. And I think this is a good poem to demonstrate how even poetry that doesn't have a super explicit situation, or even an explicit lyric eye expressing, say, emotions or ideas, how in a poem that simply just appears at first to be um, describing or capturing a moment of perception, a sort of slice of time, how this process of studying the poem still helps us, kind of get to know it and appreciate it in a lot of different ways, and that you can still say a lot about a poem that, again, might initially seem to be simple. Although I think we're already realizing there is nothing simple about this poem or about HD's writing. All right, that'll do it for today. Um, as the timer works its way up to half an hour, thanks for spending time with me. And yeah, let's read more poems tomorrow.